So it's just quite limited in a way. It'd be nice to have a little bit, nice to have like the day and leave it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It always feels a bit unfair to me when an artist has worked so hard to install his show, and it is us who are harvesting the fruit of his labor. Dear Gerard, I'm happy to tell you that your exhibition was indeed received very enthusiastically by critics, colleagues, and visitors, and it was truly heartwarming to always see the exhibition full, seeing our guests engage in the work for long periods of time. Thank you, Gerard. I know that you were cursing this morning at 5:30 for not having shunned the effort to return in order to have this talk. We only have 4 days left of this exhibition titled Upon the Living and the Dead, in which Gerard Byrne has decided to show 3 recent works. The first work, of which you see some images here, is called something very long in Finnish dialect, which I can't pronounce, but it has an English translation called Film Inside an Image. It films and photographs the now defunct Biologiska Museet in Stockholm. And the second piece in that part is called In Our Time. It was conceived for the Skulpturenprojekte in Münster for 2017, and it's depicting a US commercial radio studio of the 70s and 80s. And thirdly, his most recent work, developed together with the artist Sven Andersson, is here in the center and is titled A Visibility Matrix, just that we know which works we are referencing to. I also would like to welcome very warmly the artist Willem De Rooij, an old friend of this institution. He had last exhibited here in 2005 together with his late partner Gerard De Rooij and Christopher Williams in collaboration with Matthias Poleda, who designed the catalog at the time. Over time, the memory of this exhibition has evolved into one of these legendary institutional moments. We are fortunate to have often seen Willem's work in Vienna over the course of the past years at MUMOC or the Kunsthalle. Some may ask themselves, as I did this morning, why we would pair these particular artists for this talk. Let me begin with the most obvious and perhaps the most irrelevant points they have in common. They are both born in 1969. They are presently both teaching at the Städelschule in Frankfurt. Both are working with similar and diverse media, and both seem to have a thing with birds. But perhaps more important than biographical analogies is that they are both representative of a generation of artists for who the re-evaluation of time-based narratives is of central importance. In their respective approach to the making of institutional exhibitions as such, they both deliberate the concepts of mediality, museology, and history. Their work, however, manifests and articulates itself always in the wickerwork of the present and the contemporary. The exhibition program of the Secession is curated by artists. We are therefore very happy to have the opportunity here tonight to look and perhaps even review Gerard Byrne's exhibition together with Willem De Rooij from an artist's perspective. Thank you for both your generosity. We are looking forward to this conversation.
Sylvie, thank you for this introduction. I would want to start by asking whether my microphone is working. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Gerard, would you say a word?
Hello, hello. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, good. So that's working. So before we get started, it's really fantastic to be here tonight. Fantastic to be in your show, Gerard, and always a big pleasure to be in Vienna and especially in the Secession. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
And I got stuck on something, Sylvie, that you said like very late in your introduction, and that has nothing to do with anything. But I just caught up I just got stuck on the word generation because it's a word I'm always very afraid of, and something that I sometimes talk about with people that I meet in the school where I work in Frankfurt called the Städelschule, and we sometimes talk about generations, or we talk about isms regularly. So then I ask them if they could name me some isms, and then I come back with other isms. So then it's like, what have you, all sorts of isms. But they always forget, the younger people with whom I talk always forget generationism. So that's the one that I throw in. And then does it mean something to you that we are of the same generation? Is that something that you ever think of? Do you think about your generation? Have you ever thought about your generation?
Well, I don't really think of. Yeah, well, insofar as the word generation seems to infer kind of some sense of a discrete group, i.e., like people born in 1969 or the years around that, as somehow vaguely hermetic. I don't think that makes much sense. I think that obviously we have developed as artists in a similar historical moment, right? Where we're addressing, whether explicitly or implicitly, we're addressing kind of comparable sort of sets of conditions, maybe, and sets of possibilities in the gallery space. So, and I think that's kind of, there's a sort of actuality to that I kind of, I do sort of agree with. I mean, I teach as well, obviously, and you see sets of concerns among students that you realize were just not sets of concerns that I encountered when I was a student, for example. And in the sense, if you try to reflect on, well, what does that amount to? But I think that the word generation, there is a sort of, in this, the biographical kind of narrative is not really tenable. The sense of biography as a determinant, that's kind of limited as a.
It always makes me feel a little claustrophobic, so I got a little scared when Sylvie brought that up.
Yeah.
But now I'm okay again. So Gerard, we're sitting in your exhibition, and you brought 3 pieces together, and you gave the show a sweeping title. Upon the living and the dead. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that later.
Yep.
And the 3 pieces. Just for argument's sake, I will say that the piece that we're sitting closest to, I will call this one piece, is a set of still photographs, and that this set of still photographs has something to do with a piece of moving image that is shown in that room, that depicts the same space, or that is made in the same space. And then there is another piece in the room that is furthest from us, and in the middle is this big assemblage of monitors, a piece that is called the Visibility Matrix, a collaboration with your colleague Sven Anderson, where the other pieces are really authored by you alone. And I thought that when I was wondering about this show, because I hadn't seen it yet, and you had sent me images and moving image and photographs, and then I tried to imagine how did he do it, and how did he use the space, and then I thought there's 2 works. This one, the piece that is set in the taxidermy museum in Stockholm, and the other piece in the furthest room that is set in a radio studio. There's one piece that that kind of brings sound to images that are otherwise still.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the taxidermy piece, and then the other work brings image to something that usually only exists of sound.
Yeah.
So they felt related to each other.
Yeah.
Did you do that on purpose?
Yeah, I mean obviously the work with the unpronounceable title. It's a Southern Sami. It's a phrase in Southern Sami, which is actually a translation from my working title, which was Film Inside an Image. And I can go into why it has this difficult title. But that's obviously the oldest work in the show. So actually for me, in a way, that's a separate work to this. They come out of the same space, but they were made at different times, and they have a certain autonomy, from each other. In a way, they're two different, obviously interrelated projects, but they're two different outcomes, we'll say. Two distinct outcomes, I think, from a sort of set of interests. So the Film Inside an Image work, it began with this interest in this Biologiska Museum in Stockholm, which is basically, it's probably about the size of this space, excluding the cut-off areas. It's probably a little bit larger than the space that we're in now, and it's a huge. It's probably taller than this space. It's a huge 360-degree diorama of a kind of Nordic wilderness that was made in the 1890s. I recall now when we installed the show here, we talked about weird correspondences between that space and this space, because firstly, the buildings date from almost the same time, right? The Biologiska Museum is from 1893, and I don't know, what's the year of secession?
1898.
Okay, so they're 5 years apart. And the Biologiska Museum is also top lit, but it's not obvious when you're a visitor that it's top lit. You can't see that it's top lit because you encounter it in a very constrained, within a kind of very constrained viewing structure that really delimits what you can actually see. But the fact that the space is top lit, it's lit by natural light, is a very important part of the project for me. It's actually the central part of the project in a way. So for me, as I say, I began with this idea that space was a kind of it was a museum, you might say. It's a taxidermy museum, but in a way, it's a kind of proto-camera, or it's a kind of a proto, because it's this diorama, which is essentially an image, is only lit by daylight. There's no artificial light in it. So in the winter time, the museum has to close. In Stockholm, it has to close at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon because there's no more daylight. Right?
Have you been there in the dark?
Yeah, the first time I went there, actually, it was in the winter, and I have been there in the dark, but the first time I went there was distinctive because the roof was covered in snow. So all the light in the space had come through a layer of snow, and it just had this very particular quality. I didn't know at that stage how the space was constructed, so I didn't understand really what I was looking at, but I was sort of intrigued by it, and then I sort of dug into it. Actually, a few years later, I went back and dug into it and just said, what was that? And then I made a project from there, which was all about this kind of analogy between the idea of this museum and a camera, that essentially it has the structure of a camera.
Why does it have the structure of a camera?
Because it's a chamber, like a camera, right? And it has an image that's formed inside it, and the image is formed by light entering through an aperture, right? And so in that sense, so
it's round, like it's a round space, yeah.
And the other thing, of course, is that, as you can see, even from these images, the taxidermy, the animals are posed in what I would consider almost like proto-photographic positions. And in the 1890s, when the museum was built, you couldn't really take photographs of wild animals. There actually were no photographs of wild animals. It wasn't technically possible at that point to do it. So photography was well established, but not of wild animals. So in that sense, it does have this kind of proto-photographic character. It's a speculation on what photographs of wild animals would look like if it were possible to make them.
And is taxidermy a very old phenomenon, much older than that?
I think it's...
I'm just thinking of paintings of animals.
Yeah, well, I
how were they made?
Question. I actually don't know much about the history of taxidermy. Anybody know anything about the history of taxidermy? But I'm assuming, yeah. I mean, it's embedded in hunting traditions, right? I mean,
must be, yeah.
And I guess, but anyway, so that was kind of my departure point, and I wanted to make a film. Literally, as the title suggests, I wanted to make a film inside what I had conceptualized as an image, what I'd understood as an image. So, hence, that's what the project Inside is. And I made the film. It was quite a complicated production. And then it made sense. Somehow, I had to make this decision about the sound, whether there should be sound or not. And obviously, the space is completely silent because nothing moves in the space.
They're very dead.
They're very dead,
yeah.
And there's no access to the space. They're completely cut off. It's behind glass. Yeah. So I realized that the only real sound in the space was the sound of us making the film, actually. So I pondered it, and then I realized, I tried this idea of this very cacophonious, noisy kind of inhabited soundtrack, which is what we have here. And I just tried to make that to see how it would work in relation to the image. And then I realized, for me anyway, I think it draws out some qualities in the image. One of the qualities it draws out is deadness.
I thought so, and
right.
And I hear, when I'm looking at the piece, I hear the animals that I see, right? And sometimes the sound is introduced a little bit before I see them, but that's more or less what happens. And I also notice it's incredibly noisy. It's it's a really, really noisy track, which is very strange for such a dead space.
Yeah.
So it's a very odd effect. And then you said to me earlier that you feel that film for you has a lot to do with photography because you felt that the room has something to do with the camera, but I still don't really understand why or how.
I mean, in a way, I think what I was interested in, I mean, I've sort of articulated a little bit how I kind of conceived of the space, that the museum, how I understood the space as a working understanding of the space for the project, which was this premise that the space had this camera-like character.
Exactly,
right?
yeah. Through the effect of the light.
Yeah, the relationship with daylight, the relationship of inside to outside, the sense of like a frozen motion. Also the other thing that I think is important is there's a sense of, because it's a 360-degree diorama, there's a continuity within the image. It transitions from one type of landscape to another, but it does so with this anxiety about like smooth transition, right? So there isn't any ruptures within the actual diorama, right? It's got a continuousness to it.
And that's how you depict it also, because you film it as if it is almost one motion.
Yeah, but I also realized, the way it's filmed, of course, mirrors that continuity. But the other thing that I think is important about the continuity is I realized that this sense of like spatial continuity is a kind of a core attribute of the photograph. Like photographs tend to, at least in the historical sense of what a photograph is, it tends to render, the space that's rendered in the photograph has a kind of pictorial continuity within it, right? So when you look at a photograph that has two animals in it, there's a sense, you understand it that they inhabit the same space, right? That's inferred in the photographic, in the photographic meaning. And I realized, as we talked about earlier, with film, I think that one of the sort of the most fundamental gesture of film is the edit.
It's a rupture.
right?
The collaging.
Is the sense that you can edit and be in a different place, or be later, or be earlier, or be one way or the other. The rupture of the edit is like the kind of core, almost the core attribute of the film, right? At least in terms of as a kind of idiom, you know, as a kind of a cultural form, as opposed to a technical form. And so I wanted to make a work that in a way sort of de-differentiated the relationship between a still image and a moving image. And so I went to some lengths to make a film that doesn't have any edits in it.
So it's a photo.
So it's a sort of continuous space. The film depicts a continuous space with no rupture.
It's a very noisy.
It's a noisy,
long
continuous, transitional. It's a noisy photo at some level. I think the other thing it does is, in a way, so there's a sense in which the sound I think ultimately the sound kind of, for me, it sort of mocks the image, or it mocks the idea of an image.
What is the sound? Where did you get that? Where?
So it's compiled in a very pragmatic way from a mix of some field recordings that are just very general atmospheric field recordings.
That are stock recordings?
No, we made some very general field recordings, but then the actual sound of the particular birds or animals came from libraries.
So you put them on top.
And then we basically sort of mixed them in and sort of positioned them and animated them and mixed them as you've inferred in relation to the picture. Yeah. So the sound obviously is made in reference to the picture. So
it's such a wild soundtrack. I thought it could almost, in the way that these images become again another piece that comes out of the same space. That soundtrack almost feels like it could be a piece in itself because it's so outrageous.
Yeah, I like how it sounds in the gallery. I also, I guess a lot of the other work I've made, almost all the other work I've made, or not almost, but a lot of the other work I've made is actually driven by the human voice. And so I was interested, I was quite compelled by the idea of making something, I mean, the animals, insofar as, I mean, like one sort of sensible understanding of animal calls is that it's animals communicating with other animals, right? So in that sense, there's a way in which, you know, the work kind of stages some sense of some idea of communication happening, like animals calling to one another, birds calling to one another. And at the same time, it's a type of communication that's not legible to us. And so that was interesting, you know, in the wake of all the other work I've made that's so driven by voice, we'll say.
How does the Sami title come in? Speaking of things that are different, are maybe not legible to everybody.
Yeah, well, the Sami title is, of course...
It's such a small language.
Is sort of... do you want some water?
Yes, please.
The Sami title is, of course, a little bit informed by those ideas, but it's also like a little bit informed by some other ideas as well. So basically, when I went to make the work, I pragmatically recognized the need for a title. And initially, I mean, I had this working title, and initially I thought, well, you know, it should be in Swedish, right? Because, you know, I'm making this thing in Sweden, and maybe it should be in Swedish. There's no reason why it should be in English, particularly. And often with previous works, titles somehow have come out of some text in the work. You know, it's often quite a binary relationship between the title and the work. In this case, I didn't have a text like that to reference. So initially I thought of Swedish, and then I guess I realized, for one thing, that Swedish is not the only indigenous language to that region. So there's no particular reason why it needed to be Swedish. And then I thought about the merits of using another language, and I realized that actually one of the, you know, the Sami languages also are, you know, the Sami peoples are not exclusively, but they are indigenous to that region, and so there was a sort of groundedness to that relationship, and I think I was interested in the idea of a title that didn't that had a little bit of this kind of quality that was difficult to pin down, that it wasn't directly legible, even pronounceable is difficult, and that, it sort of reflected a little bit on this idea of modes of communication that I don't understand, or that maybe, a lot of people wouldn't understand. So there's different dialects of Sami, and it was actually quite hard to find somebody who to work with on it, but I did find an artist, and his particular dialect is South Sami, so it's South Sami.
So there's still some languages for you to learn.
Potentially.
Like I said, Dr. Doolittle. So how does that then? Because we started talking about how do these works relate to each other, and you started talking about that one.
Yeah.
And this one is another. I now know. But now, when I'm thinking of that other piece, why did that end up in the same exhibition? Because I thought that there was a relation to the...
In terms of... for me, the opportunity of doing this show was really... I think in the end, and I think it's actually worked out in this way for me, is that it was an opportunity to put these works side by side, think about them together.
Which you hadn't done before?
I'd never shown any of the works together. So it was an opportunity to put them together, see them together, and talk to people about how they work together. And actually, this is a great credit to Secession because it's all made, fairly effortless, but they're all, with the possible exception of the photographs, everything else is actually quite demanding to install as a work. So, and I've come to learn the hard way as an artist that if you make works that are difficult to install, they tend to be shown less often. Whether they're good or bad isn't really the point. If they're difficult to install, they get shown less often. And so, so I'm really trying to simplify things, but so far no good.
Not very successfully, I think.
But Secession, did a brilliant job on putting the works together, and so in that sense, it's a privileged situation. So that was the immediate kind of possibility of this or opportunity of this show. Beyond that, I somehow was always interested in the relationship between those two works.
It's a strong relationship.
Yeah, they have a lot of formal similarities in terms of they're both these back projections. They both have very present audio tracks. There's dichotomies in the relationship between sound and picture in both works, and so. So it felt like, it was useful to put them together. I actually initially, as Bettina knows, when I was sketching out, like trying to figure out the installation plan for the space, I was actually really trying to figure out ways of pairing the works in a very direct way, physically. They were the sort of early ideas that go in the waste bin sooner or later, and this is a happier configuration, but certainly I had a very keen interest in putting the works together.
The work in that other room is called In Our Time.
Yeah.
It's a period piece, I would say, like a costume drama.
Sure, it is a period.
Yeah, it's a period. Very much so. So you seem to you produce a situation that feels and looks and sounds as if we're somewhere in the late 70s or early 80s, maybe. It's a sound studio that is an existing sound studio, right? That you used as a sound studio in Dublin, I think, and you adapted this sound studio and dressed it up to become the set that we can now look at.
Yeah.
And this work follows the working day of a disc jockey. who
Yeah.
talks in between the records that he plays. And this sound studio is used as a radio studio, but also as a recording studio for a band that goes in and out of the rooms, and these different scenes and these different ways of using that sound studio are visible to us as viewers. And there's a sound layering that plays with our perception in interesting ways, because the sounds that you experience when you're in the room are not always relating to the images that you see, depending on where you stand and depending the moment that you enter the room and leave again.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you called it a period piece, because at another time, and maybe with another work, I might be phobic about that word, about that term.
But it feels so important to me that it is.
I think it's interesting in this sense, because I think the work is very, very directly engaged with questions of periodicity, of time, of like how do you kind of concretize a time? Like, even when you characterize the time that it's set in. Lots of people always ask me, because it's a kind of a default question. They ask you, when is it set? Like, what year is it set in? And the work.
They want to know an exact moment.
Yeah, they're like, is it 1978? Is it like, and they want that type of fixity, but the work doesn't have a specific. It's purposefully not fixed in that sense.
That feels purposeful to me.
It's quite evasive on certain. Like, there's a weird. I think with the work, like if I kind of characterize the work, I think that there's there's certain dynamics or patterns that occur across the work, and one of them is that. Visually, it seems to have a specificity to it. The way the camera work is done and the way the camera inhabits the space of the radio studio gives an impression. Basically signifies specificity. It signifies details of the studio. It's details of like the equipment or the guy changing the record, or there's this kind of sense of detail, right, or of specificity to it.
Mm-hmm.
That really, my sense is that actually it sort of draws you in and seemingly kind of anchors you in the space at some level. And then at the same time, there's a type of evasiveness in the sense that there's an evasiveness in terms of the period that it's set in. If you listen closely, there's lots of contradictions. There's continuous contradictions.
Yeah, I noticed a couple that confused me too greatly.
The radio station changes continuously. The guy, his persona shifts from time to time. I mean, I kind of took liberty to kind of construct a figure like that, because I listened to a lot of, in researching the project, I listened to lots of old American commercial radio, and I realized that a lot of these kind of figures are really sort of schizophrenic characters. They're really crazy kind of guys.
You told me that the text as it is now spoken is based on existing material that you found doing your research, and you produced transcripts and then made a collage out of those transcripts, right? So that, like, what we are now listening to are words that are actually once were spoken like that. Yeah. And they're shuffled and became a new reality. And this non-specificity is something that you mention it a couple of times. So does that have to do? So why? I'm sorry, but before you continue, I want to get back to you saying that you would have not liked it in the past if somebody would have called this a period piece. Yeah. What is the word that you used? Phobic?
Phobic.
Yeah. So why would that make you phobic?
Because I guess I'm...
are there bad examples in your head of something you don't like, or what is that?
I suppose I have a sort of deep-rooted skepticism of the capacity of an image to adequately sort of depict a period, right?
So you would find that.
So in that sense, I think it's a flawed proposition.
Okay.
From the beginning.
Yeah.
And I guess that refers to like realism basically in film. So I don't come from that. That's not a starting point for me artistically. I'm coming from a different place, but I am interested in images, and I'm interested in ideas of continuity, and I'm interested in ideas of the relationship between images and time, and the concreteness of temporality, but of time. I think one of the things that's interesting...
But weirdly, what you are now describing as this piece actually is a period. It's not a moment, it's a period, because it's like it's a rather a spectrum of moments.
Yeah.
That is more or less defined in time, that you took your inspiration from.
Yeah.
Yeah, or a lot of your inspirations.
Yeah, I suppose so, but it's quite it's vague in ways.
Yeah.
So one of the things that struck me when I was doing the research was, I think there's a very sort of default assumption when you think about popular music, and you think about how it relates to time, and you imagine like radio station, a commercial radio station in 1980, well, what does it play? And then you think about like the music that was, the hits from 1980, right? But then actually when you listen to old radio, as I've done a lot of, you realize that actually you're as likely to hear Frank Sinatra on a radio broadcast in 1980 as you are to hear the Eurythmics.
Yeah.
It's just so what you realize is that although popular music seems to have a luring kind of direct sense to a temporal moment, it's not, the radio doesn't work in that. It has its own idea of temporality, and of course
that's the flaw of many period pieces, right? That like when something is said in 1980, that everything in the image comes out of 1980.
Yeah,
exactly out of 1980.
But it's also interesting to think about the idea of the radio broadcast in its time, and to think about, like, for example, a radio station in 1980 and how they decided what to play on a given afternoon. Do you know what I mean? And how they, in that afternoon, construct some idea, some temporality, and construct a kind of a present tense of that moment. And that's, of course, a very kind of loose and difficult to kind of chart kind of thing, but at the same time it's quite interesting. And they're the types of qualities that I took as kind of license for the work. I mean, I think the other thing that's important to say about the work is that actually, it's called In Our Time because actually there's a gesture within the work which is that in a way the time that it inhabits is literally our time. Is the time that we're in right now. So there's a sort of a weird, again, this kind of gesture of de-differentiation, which seems to be a kind of thing that I'm interested in collapsing distinctions and sort of melding things together. So there's a sense in which, even though we focus on it being a kind of period piece and we try to chronologize it, we try to locate it in the 70s or 80s, there is a sense in which I suppose as an artwork, it's preoccupied with inhabiting this time, the time we live in now. And that's why it has this structure, where the time checks are in sync with the time of day, wherever it's been shown, and other gestures related to that.
How does that work exactly? Because the piece is edited so, as you told me before, there's a basic, the piece is a basic block of information, of imagery and text, and then it repeats or loops. And in this loop there are variations built in that will anchor the piece not only in the location, so there will be then references that talk about maybe Vienna when it's played in Vienna and Dublin when it's played in Dublin, and there's anchor points that will relate to the moment, so the time, the actual time.
How does it work? So there's a bit of as you're paraphrasing it, so there's a little bit of technology that keeps it, that makes it play at the right time of day, right? that makes it start at the right time in the morning and play all through the day at the kind of right time. But in terms of the edit is sort of unorthodox in the sense that it has a modular kind of structure. So we made an edit, it's, X amount of time, that's then repeatable. But as it repeats, it doesn't repeat in the same way. There's a sort of template, there's parts of it that repeat, and then there's parts of it that are changed in each module.
Yeah.
And, obviously parts of it have to change in order for it to stay in reference to the time of day, because he has to say the time of day as it is, So in that sense, there's a sort of earnest effort in the construction of the work to kind of stay in sync with
keep it in our time.
Yeah, keep it in our time. And obviously there's some sort of staging of a relationship between our time and then another time, which is the time that the period piece sort of character to it. There's some sort of a staging of the relationship between those two things. And I think that connects structurally in terms of the installation to how the work occupies, the kind of rear projection and then those front big speakers at the front. That's essentially one soundtrack on those front speakers, which is essentially the broadcast, what would be broadcast on the radio. And then the other speakers in the space is essentially a completely different soundtrack that plays in parallel.
This is the world that the DJ inhabits and that the band inhabits, that is to be seen in the image.
You might say it's the space that the camera inhabits.
Yeah.
Right?
And then there is, as a part of the installation, there's a grand piano in the room that we can enter over here. Why is that? How did that end up there? Because that's not producing any sound.
Give credit to Secession for the piano, but the piano is a sort of. I like the piano. It's a sort of legacy from the first time the work was shown, which was the first time I made the work. As Sylvia pointed out, was for this sculpture project in Münster, and I showed the work in this space that had it was actually a music rehearsal space. That was its sort of normal life, and there was a grand piano in it, and of course I could have had the piano removed for the exhibition, but I somehow thought the piano was interesting. It was an interesting way of negotiating the space. The actuality of the space in Münster was to use this piano as this kind of pawn of negotiation, right? And so the piano stayed, and I ended up kind of incorporating. There's some piano music in the soundtrack. There was a piano in the space that we filmed in, and so we recorded some piano, and so the piano kind of got woven into the work, and now it's just the most conspicuous gesture of this idea that there's a way in which the work really tries to go from you might say from a filmic space, which is the space behind the screen that we see at the screen surface, and the way it tries to spill into the space of wherever it's been shown.
Yeah, it anchors it in
the piano becomes the really heavy part of that spillage, right?
Yeah, no, it's really it's one of the heaviest elements of this whole exhibition.
Yeah,
and I thought it was very strange that it's hidden in the dark. It feels like almost like that moose that is standing there, like
sort of in the
sort
corner.
of big presence
Sulky.
that is like sort of lurking behind you.
Yeah.
Very, very different energy that object has. So it really stands out in the exhibition.
And the music is beautiful. It's Chopin, and it's very melancholic music.
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of goes with the mood you're describing. It's a moody piano.
So these two pieces or three pieces actually that we've now, I want to move on to the piece that we haven't talked about, and I don't want to call it the elephant in the room, but it's like that piece to me. It's like that's a big that would be the piano, but there's this complex installation that inhabits the middle of the space. And to me, but that work, it's differently thought and differently constructed than some of the other works that you show here and that you anyway make. And in many ways, to me, it feels like you like the other works come together so easily, and there's such a union between these other works that it almost felt as if you wanted to throw a hand grenade in the middle and kind of loosen it up again.
Yeah.
That's how I experience it, because these other works are so... there's this great unity in thought and in imagery and in installation, whereas this work that is here next to us consists out of a great amount of images that are shown on a great amount of monitors made by a great amount of authors, because you work together with many different artists that are, and other image producers that are colleagues of yours and of mine. And
it's the problem child in the room.
It's the problem child, and the problem child is put in the middle, and it's also the first thing we see, and it's like, and it feels like everything explodes a bit over there. And this piece is called the Visibility Matrix. And you made that together with a colleague of yours called Sven Andersson. And Sven Andersson, as far as I understood, is a tech person with whom you work usually to install the works that you author. So, for instance, a piece like In Our Time will be installed by Sven Andersson, and in this case, you produced a piece together with him where the images do not bear your authorship because they're made by other people.
Yeah.
So what happened?
So Visibility Matrix. Sven and I developed it. I mean, Sven has done a lot of technical work for me. Sven's the guy who figures out how to make In Our Time play back in real time, for example.
Not unimportant, because as you mentioned, these very tech-heavy works, lots of people have to work to make them work.
Yeah. So, but Sven's also an artist in his own right, and basically, as we had worked on projects together, problem solving, you might say, the installation of shows of mine over the years, we worked very closely together, and we developed, I guess we started to recognize some ideas and possibilities that we were interested in that couldn't really be addressed within the kind of given format of A, those monographic exhibitions, and B, maybe within the given format of my practice.
But those were like glitches that you guys both liked, or what?
Just you realize that actually we were developing like
a language
and developing like strategies and attitudes and sometimes quite complex kind of approaches to things that were then sort of being siloed down to serve very direct purposes. We developed like a whole way of configuring works in relation to another, attitudes of how works relate to one another across a space, just to facilitate, another Gerard Byrne show.
Yeah, and it always ends up being a Gerard Byrne show.
Yeah, and I suppose in a way, so on one level there was an appetite there that we shared to develop something different together. I mean, that was a kind of quite a human approach, you might say. But on another level, I think that one of the things that maybe sanctioned the project from my own perspective was that I've become increasingly aware of the idea of like media art in a gallery as a sort of potentially anachronistic proposition, right? As something that really is up for review as a kind of approach. And we started this conversation talking about generations and being skeptical about the word generations. But I am aware of the fact that the kind of the model, we'll say, of a media artist is quite historically specific, and has quite a limited history, and we maybe are in. The question is whether we're still in the Baroque moment of the media artist, or if we've already gone into the Rococo. That remains to be seen. But one way or the other, I think we're at a time where.
I think you should speak for yourself here.
But I think one way or the other, the idea that it's just about setting up video projectors and black boxes, I think that's maybe that's up for some question, and I think that in a way I don't have like alternative strategies particularly.
So this would be a way to throw a couple of questions
up.
up.
It's a way to start thinking about some questions.
Yeah.
It's a way to start thinking about some questions, and that's maybe where the appetite to get into this project began.
Can you quickly describe how it functions? Because we're seeing we're seeing different monitors, we're seeing different images projected. Sometimes the same image can be seen on several monitors.
Mm-hmm. I can talk
through
about
which it rhymes. There is Sven Andersson, but there's also a lot of other artists involved. So who made what, and why does it look like this?
So it has quite a layered structure. So essentially, we were interested in doing a project. We had this sort of basis that I've already described, this appetite for making a project together, and we were reflecting on a lot of these questions together. But also, we were interested in ideas. I've been interested for a long time in ideas of kind of patterns, interested in patterns and conditions and things that recur. And a lot of those a lot of patterns and conditions are things that paradoxically can't be represented in pictures, right? So the picture, in a way, might be subject to the conditions, but it can't actually really represent the condition. It can't depict the conditions. It can only be subject to conditions. Cultural conditions, semiotic conditions, photographic conditions, whatever. There's a way in which the picture, in a way, has a type of limitation as a mode, we'll say. And so we realized that actually we were interested in ideas about the relationship between images and networks, which is a question of our moment, right? Historically, I suppose, the idea of the image is something that's made. I mean, these are analog photographs, so they're by definition offline. They're in terms of their construction, they're discrete, right? And as we talked about earlier, one of the starting points for the project was just revisiting somebody like Roland Barthes, right? And taking that as a kind of touchstone idea of the lens-based image. And you realize that, when you kind of really reduce kind of the Barthes argument, you might say, to paraphrase it, you might say that it's all about the scarcity of the image, right? It's all about the scarcity of the photograph and the scarcity of the moment that the photograph depicts, right? It's all about scarcity. It's a kind of culture of scarcity, right? And of course, it's not the moment we live in now.
That's another time.
Yeah, we live in a completely different moment, and the way that photographic, it's now digital, whatever, it doesn't matter, but the way all that imagery is produced now is on the pretext of a completely different reality. And the different reality is not only, one thing is proliferation, right? So it's the opposite of scarcity. But the other thing is dissemination, right? So I could sort of say that maybe this is the only print of this image in the world. I don't know if there may be another print, but I could say there's one or two at most in existence, right?
You don't know that?
I should know this stuff, but I don't, it's written down somewhere. But anyway, that's a kind of characteristic, defining characteristic of those images, which is perverse in the world we live in now, and it's completely non-representative of how images exist in the world. And so the idea of the network has become a sort of given. It's a de facto in the production of images, to the point where actually when we make images, we're already thinking about their dissemination, and we're already thinking about how they exist within a network. And so they became like starting points for manifesting this project, right? So its physical structure is a matrix or a network, right? It's actually offline. It's not connected to the internet. Everything is kind of, so in that sense, it has a certain sculptural quality in the sense that it's specific to here. And I suppose a little bit like this, there is only one copy of it.
It's frozen. It mimics a network.
It's a kind of reduction or a model at some level, and then it has a certain behavior. It's interesting to spend time here in the space with it. That's what I like about these white benches, is that it allows you to just kind of sit in the space.
Yeah, I like that.
And kind of let it behave in front of you and kind of witness it. And it actually has its own behavior. It's programmed in a way. So like we have a lot of material which we had conversations with dozens of contributors, all about these ideas that we're talking about now.
Artists like Lucy Raven or Rosa Barba or Sean Snyder, different colleagues, maybe even
some non-artists as well.
Non-artists as well.
Yeah.
And Sven Anderson and you produced the overarching structure.
Yeah.
And these colleagues delivered snippets of moving image that
some things are very short,
produce.
Some things are hours long. It's very variable.
Right.
And so basically we take everything, we put all the material on each screen. So there's 14 screens, and each screen has a kind of a player, and every player has all of the material in the project on it. So there's a lot of material. And then the system edits the material in real time. So it's editing as it's going. And it's editing, and it's coming up with sequences of the material. It's a gesture of sorting and arranging and comparing and contrasting. You know, in that sense, there's a kind of a gestural quality to the work.
That's where the patternedness comes in that you were talking about.
And so then there's this voice, which is now silenced, this voiceover.
Yeah.
Which is in a way, I guess we joked, we were talking about kind of HAL 2000 character, a kind of we had this idea of like we wanted the system to speak back to us or to speak. So then
this space also has that.
Yeah, it has a little bit of 2001
kind of feeling.
Quality. Yeah, so absolutely, yeah. And I wonder if Kubrick ever came here. That'd be anyway interesting to ponder. So in a way, there's this voiceover which seems to, at some level, be a protagonist, we'll say, in this sort of sorting, collating, comparing, contrasting series of activities.
The voice comes from comes out of nowhere, and all the electricity comes out of the ceiling. And the show is called Upon the Living and the Dead. So we feel that there is, if not Stanley Kubrick, maybe some other something else hanging above us, either working on the electricity or on any other kind of order. Is there something that I forgot to ask you or that you want to say, or would you feel that we can see if there's some questions out of the room?
No, I think that's pretty comprehensive. I could talk about the title. Is that what do you want me to say something about the title?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a.
But then briefly, because I have the feeling that there might be some.
Yeah. So the title is actually Upon All the Living and the Dead. It's even more pretentious. You have to come up with titles, right? The other alternative for a title is Gerard Byrne, which is kind of boring. Sometimes you come up with a title and you think, well, it's an opportunity let's raise the stakes here, know. And
you don't show every day at Secession, so.
I will say that for anybody who's involved with it's a quote from James Joyce. It's one of the last lines from the story The Dead, from the book Dubliners. And it's a very it's quite a known line from Joyce. I mainly love the story because I love the film. I don't know if you've ever seen the film by John Huston, The Dead. It's an amazing film. It's a really amazing film, and towards the end, very melancholic. And towards the end of it, there's this line, you know, upon all the living and the dead, and it's kind of, I think it's given in voiceover actually, and so in that sense it seems apropos as a title for the whole thing. And also I just always loved the way in which the phrase upon all the living and the dead, again, this gesture of de-differentiation, it de-differentiates between the living and the dead. It's talking about snow falling. So he's talking about snow falling, and the snow fell upon all the living and the dead indiscriminately, right? And I think for me, apart from anything else, it also appeals to this idea of something that's more pervasive, that's kind of about conditions or something, which I think in some ways is an idea that I'm trying to work through across all these works. As I said earlier, this kind of the paradox of working with like photographic images, when you realize like certain things you can't actually represent within a photographic image, to do with conditions and persistence and patterns. Mm. So that's the spirit of it.
Thank you. Mm.